Time goes quick, doesn't it? I mean, sixth session already. And unfortunately, this session we're going to have not so much scripture. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow morning when we actually dive into 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Because that'll be getting into stuff I love to talk about as scripture. But what we ended up doing is we've been going through, and you've seen the theme that Pastor George laid out here, right? We started with our responsibility to God, our responsibility to Scripture, our responsibility to the world, to the unbeliever, to the church. But now we get into the difficult one, our responsibility to culture. So we're going to talk social justice. Now, I want to do something a little different with this, because when we talk social justice, this is it requires proper definition of terms, okay? And so I know, like the first night, just because there were some questions that came up, people were not understanding me completely with what I was focusing on when I said that the scriptures are sufficient for everything, and I speak against the idea of people saying that God speaks to me. I'm talking in reference to direct revelation. In this one, if you don't understand the definition, it's going to be really hard to continue, and I don't want to lose anyone. So here's what we're going to do. If I'm mentioning something and you've got a question, I think we're going to do like a Q&A after, but if you have a question with something, stop me, just raise your hand so I can make sure you understand the definition of terms, okay? Because when it comes to this, and in fact, the thing that kind of makes it hard with this whole social justice movement, the terms change for whatever they need. And that makes it, understanding social justice is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall, okay? We're going to change it for whatever we want it to say. So I'm going to give you the thing to understand the whole idea of social justice movement in a nutshell right up front. It's simply this. It simply comes down to the thing of you have people trying to push an agenda, and they are not really caring how they get there as long as they get there. And so they don't mind changing definitions. They don't mind throwing out common sense. They'll change everything as long as they can get to their goal, what they think is their goal. And when we've seen historically, when they finally get to the goal that they claim is going to be, nirvana. Oh, wait, that's the water we're drinking. Sorry. Had to put that in there, right? So when they think they're going to get to that ultimate spot, then they can't figure out why it never worked. Well, there's a very simple reason why social justice never works. We're going to end up talking about things like social justice, CRT. We're going to quiz you and see if you know what CRT stands for. I can pretty much guarantee that not a single person in this room is going to know what CRT really stands for. We'll see. You could prove me wrong. But we're going to talk about CRT. We're going to talk about intersectionality. We're going to give all these things. And the thing is, as we look at this, the thing that they are starting with is they ignore the fact that human beings are born in sin. That's an essential thing to all of us. The whole thing is if we humans are evolved creatures that could rise up to a superior and ultimate type of form of government where everything is great and everything's peaceful. In other words, they think they can create heaven on earth. And they can't because they ignore the sin nature of human beings. So let's give a little bit of a definition. So social justice is also a concept that is used to describe the movement towards a socially just world. In other words, the global justice movement is what's sometimes referred to. In this context, social justice is based on a concept of human rights and equality and can be defined as, quote, the way in which human rights are manifested in the everyday lives of people at every level of society, unquote. They're going to try to come up with a way to create human rights. Okay, let's just stop at that and ask the question. Where do we get our rights from? Huh? God. Does government give us our rights? No. We actually see that in our founding documents, by the way. Now, when I said last night that I think that we're coming under a time of persecution, let me give you an idea. How many of you have heard of the term Christian nationalist? Okay. How many of you believe that term came from Christians? Raise your hand. How many of you believe that it came from the media? Raise your hand. Yeah. Christian nationalist is the derogatory term to basically be a way of attacking Christians, but seem like you're making a separation. It's like these extremist Christians. So what they do is say Christian nationalists. And they've now come out and defined what a Christian nationalist is. A Christian nationalist is one who believes that people get their rights from God and not government. Well, that's like in our founding documents. But hey, we could just throw that away now because we don't need that. That's what we're up against. So we're going to talk about CRT. Who thinks they know what it stands for? Oh, you think it's right there? What, you think that CRT stands for critical race theory? Sorry. Does anyone else think they know what it means? That's the wrong answer. That's what they say it is, but that's not actually what it stands for. Let me tell you what it actually stands for. CRT stands for Cultural Racism Training. Once you understand that, you understand exactly what CRT is. So they talk about it as critical race theory, which is born out of this thing called race theory, but it is the idea that racism is in the fabric of our society and we cannot separate ourselves from it. Now, it's quite interesting because when they talk about this as being in the fabric of America, just recently they had Boston black churches that are demanding reparations from the white churches. Not the white people, just the white churches, huh? Was slavery legal in Boston? Ever? No. So what were the black churches asking for money for? For slavery that existed somewhere else? You see, it doesn't actually have to be an issue where there actually is slavery or that there was slavery to argue for racism. They just redefine it. See, racism used to be when you show preferential treatment to someone because of the color of their skin or the race that they are, or you give someone lack of treatment, you discriminate against them because of their race or color of their skin or whatever it may be. However, that definition is not the definition you use today. Why? Because you have people who are black that are called racist against blacks. Because it has nothing to do anymore with color of skin. It has to do with your politics, with your economics. Okay? So you'll hear a term, white privilege. Okay? It's kind of interesting. Do you know we live in a generation where boys can say they're girls, but whites can't say they're blacks? We were just talking with a couple of the guys that teach in school. In a school in our district where I live, they have a room for kitty litters because some of the kids think they're cats. So you could be a cat, but a white person can't be black. How do we know that? Oh, because the person that used to run the DNC, or I forgot her name now, but she was white. And they blackballed her. Oh, we can't say blackball anymore. Sorry, I guess they whiteballed her. Because you're not allowed to that, but by doing that, you're appropriating someone's culture. So you see, I have all these rules and these limits, and there's no definition to these things. They blur the lines where they want, something as clear as male and female. By the way, do you know how I know that the people who claim that there's gender fluidity, that there's multiple genders and gender could be fluid, you know how I know they don't believe it? I'll tell you how. Because every one of them that's born a biological male who claims that they are fluid in their gender and they are now transitioned to they identify as a female, you know what they do? They dress and act and do things that are stereotypical for women and vice versa. And they talk about it. They talk about how they had to learn how to put makeup on because they didn't grow up with girlfriends doing that. Well, if you were born this way and it's all fluid, you wouldn't need to dress any different or act any different or be the stereotypical opposite sex. Unless, of course, there's only two sexes. Right? If there's two sexes, two genders, then you try to be the opposite because you're trying to say, well, I'm a girl, so I'm fitting in as a girl, so I have to act like what a girl typically is. And the same for a guy. Why do they do that? I mean, if it's really fluid, if you believe it's fluid, you wouldn't need to do that. So if they don't believe it, why should I? The idea of CRT is to marginalize everybody that doesn't fit in with their system. So in other words, the claim is that the reason that America is a inherently racist country is because it's in the fabric of our country. And because of that, every decision is racist because we used to have slavery. Did we have slavery everywhere? Nope, we didn't. Northern states were free. Now the argument is, well, you have to understand that me being white, I benefited from that slavery. Really? Because my family is from Russia and Romania. We weren't part of the African slave trade. When people come to me with the argument that, this whole thing of, well, you have to understand you have white privilege because of the way blacks were treated in America. Really? Because, I don't know if you realize this. Does anyone know who was the first slave owner in America? Let me ask it this way. What color was his skin? He was black. First slave owner in America was a black man. When they had the slave trade, who is it that did the kidnappings of all the people in the inner part of Africa? Was it the white man or the Africans? It's the Africans. So see, when they talk about these things, they want a selected branch of history where anything a white man does, we're going to take into account. And anything a black man did, we're going to ignore that. It's kind of like global warming, right? We say, okay, we got this global warming thing. So let's just ignore the sun, which gives off solar flares, which kind of warms, that actually gets to Earth and warms us. So we'll ignore that. We'll ignore the magnetic force of the Earth, which actually reverses every several decades, which actually explains why there's warming and then cooling. And if you don't know it, we're going into a cooling cycle. Some of us, when we were kids in the 80s, we were looking forward to a global what? Ice age. Remember that? What was the solution for the global ice age, by the way? Government control. They must have done such a great job because then we went into a global warming and we were heating up and we were going to all melt. And what was the solution for that? Government control. So we're now going into the cooling again. I guess government doesn't have control. But the reality is they ignore everything. Let's ignore solar flares. Let's ignore volcanoes. Let's ignore the magnetic force of the Earth. Let's ignore everything but humans and then say, it's humans' fault. A friend of mine was an LA detective. He's as an author, he's known as J. Warner Wallace. But Jim Wallace, he puts it this way. He comes to a crime scene. If someone was to say, okay, his captain says, okay, we got to find out who did it, but we know it wasn't a black man. Find out who did it. Well, now what is he going to do? He's got to eliminate anyone who's black because he's being told a black man didn't do it. So you now take the evidence and say, how can we get the evidence to fit the crime and to find the person, right? If you said, okay, we know that this was done by someone inside the room, well, then you're not going to look at anyone outside the room, right? And so this is what we end up having. They end up taking this to try to make a case to say we want certain parameters, and those parameters can shift for whatever we need it to. And we don't want to use things, the real bad things like logic and common sense. Because if you apply those things, then then you don't understand that you're doing that because that's your white privilege. See, it's a beautiful argument if you think about it in a sense. If you prove a way that you don't have white privilege, that is your white privilege speaking. That's the proof of your white privilege. And so when we look at cultural racism training, what they're doing is exactly that. They're taking the culture to train the culture to be racists, to look for race in everything. One of our podcasters, he does Prescribed Truth. He has some videos he used to do that are just absolutely hilarious. He's a black guy that he does these parodies about CRT that are so realistic that he actually would get other blacks contacting him and saying, stop putting this out here. You're making us look bad. And he's like, I'm trying to make you look bad. But he takes real articles that he's seeing about white privilege, that the fact that blacks walk slower across the street than whites, and therefore they're more likely to get hit by the car. So he does a skit about them being, the whole thing is that, you whites are, because you walk faster, you gotta just slow up in your cars. Because you're white privileged, you're not letting me get across the street in time. He has got ones where he has, blacks are percent-wise, heavier than whites. And he does this thing that always cracks me up every time I watch it. I watch it whenever I need to laugh. And he's like, so it's not the fact that I'm stuffing my face, it's your white privilege that I'm fat. And he's doing it as parody. But he's taking real articles that they have out there where they're trying to say, and you look at this and go, this makes no sense. Well, that's because you're using your white privilege. Do you know that white privilege is defined as being on time? Holding down a job. Staying married to the same spouse for your entire life. That's white privilege. That's really strange to me. As this was actually being explained to me once. And I said, it's really strange because there are blacks in Africa who are married to the same person their entire life. Do they have white privilege in Africa? To which the comment I got was, you don't understand that you have so much white privilege you can't even see what's going on. Okay. And they want you to deal with them reasonably, by the way. So here's some of the tenets of critical racism theory. That's another word for it, by the way. But the central tenet is it's this idea of what's called intersectionality. And we're going to get into that in a moment. It's the whole thing of it is to challenge what they call the dominant ideology. Anyone want to guess what they consider the dominant ideology is? Christianity. That's the problem. It's a commitment to social justice, which is not social nor just, by the way. They take two words that have meanings, put them together, and radically change both. See, social justice is not social. It's antisocial. It causes divisions. And it's not justice, because they're trying to make people who had nothing to do with something pay for something they had nothing to do for. It's basically they want government to steal for them. Any of you guys remember the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street? How many of you believe that started because of a post on Facebook on a Thursday afternoon? Anyone? Does anyone know when it started? I'll give you a little bit of a hint when I got involved with it. Yes, I was involved with Occupy movement, not as a supporter, but because I did so much ministry in Washington, in Union Square Park, they invited me to join them because they wanted some spirituality added to it because they figured that would help them boast of their cause. I was involved 3 months before that Facebook post, and I know that it was in the works 3 months prior to me. Real interesting thing that happened with that. So here everyone is in Zagati Park, and they have these meetings at 10 o'clock in the morning where everybody is supposed to have a say, equal say for everybody. That sounds good, right? That is their goal in their argument for social justice, is to give equal rights to everybody. The only problem that they discovered was that there were a lot of rich kids that were in their tents, and all of their iPads and their MacBooks and their iPhones kept getting stolen. Because some people who were homeless just were taking it and selling it so that they could get some drugs. So you know what they did? A bunch of the rich kids got together, and they said, we got to figure this out. So they physically moved the tents of certain people, and they all moved their tents together so that they could protect each other's property. I kept referring to that as the upper class and lower class Zagati Park. Now remember, Occupy was about the fact that there's these elite people who have everything, and they're keeping it from everybody else. So you would think if person over here who has an iPad, person over here who doesn't, you'd think they would be happy to allow that person to take the iPad because now they can go to their parents and get another one, and now both have an iPad. And so they would sit and have these 10 o'clock meetings. And they would realize there's a problem because they couldn't get their agenda pushed through because there were a bunch of people that weren't really there for anything other than the fact they were homeless and had nothing else to do, and their food was being provided, by I just forgot his name now. He's a guy that runs all the politics behind the scenes, Soros. So Soros was providing food. So we had a bunch of homeless that were just involved because they were getting free meals every day. All they had to do was stay in Zagati Park. So they did. But the guys that were trying to run this Occupy movement, it wasn't working for them. So they decided what they needed to do was have a 9 a.m. meeting where it was just a group of them to discuss how to push through their agenda at the 10 o'clock meeting. Now, I was kicked out of the movement when I showed up to one of the Saturday morning meetings at 10 o'clock, having been at the 9 o'clock. I snuck in. And I asked the question, if the meetings are open to everyone, why do they have 9 o'clock meetings to push through their agenda for this meeting? Oops, I was a bad person and let the cat out of the bag. I was then uninvited. But it was a great experiment that their goal of making everything equal didn't even work within the dozens of people they had there at Zagati Park. Here's their movement for equality. I remember talking to one of the girls. She was up from Florida for her spring break because she wanted to be part of this movement. She was getting her degree in medicine. She had to keep a straight A average because she was getting a full ride scholarship for her medical degree. And I asked her what she's doing here. She said, well, it's just not fair. I mean, there's people like Stephen Jobs, and he's got so much money. He doesn't need all that money. He should just give away his products to other people. I said, well, if he just did that and he wasn't getting paid for it, would he have any incentive to create new products? He should just do it out of the goodness of his heart. It's like, do you realize that everywhere that argument's been tried, it's never worked? Because people don't have a goodness of their heart until they're Christian. But I'm like, so I said to her, this is where you could bang your head against the wall and actually get more accomplished than talking to some of these people, okay? But I tried to reason with her. I mean, she's got a 4.0 in medicine degree, right? You think she's intelligent, correct? Well, she might be, but common sense, non-existent. I said, do you have any of your fellow students who have to work to pay for their college? And she said, well, of course. I said, do they get A's? I don't know. I mean, do you think they probably get like C's because they're not able to spend as much time as you studying? She's like, well, probably. I said, so don't you think you should give up some of your A's, take some B's, and give them a B instead of a C because you don't have to work and they do? And she goes, I'd lose my scholarship. I said, but wouldn't that be fair? I mean, then you all have the same grade. In fact, you should give up some of your scholarship so they don't have to work as hard, and you should take a part-time job. They take a part-time job, and then you could all not only have the same grade, but you can have the same workload. She could not put the connection together what I was asking. She's just like, but I would lose my scholarship. Yes, and Steve Jobs would lose his incentive, just like you have an incentive. You see, they end up starting with this ideology that somehow they can produce a world where everything is fair. If you haven't learned this at this stage of life, let me just not surprise you and let you know, life's not fair. Get over it. Do you really want fair? Okay, so here's fair. The other part of that word, justice. You know what fairness would be? The moment you sinned, God struck you down. That's fair. I was out evangelizing with a friend of mine, Mark Spence, and someone asked him, he's like, yo, God's not just. He goes, do you want justice? He goes, yes. Really? Okay, let me ask you a question. If God gave justice at 10 after 11 today, where would you be at 11 after 11 today? The answer is hell. You really want justice? No, what we want is mercy. So social justice is not social, and it's not just. It's based on a system of unfairness. It's based on a system of stealing. But it's government-told stealing, so it's okay. It's someone else giving you permission to steal. Humans are very interesting when given permission. I forget the name of the town offhand, but in Poland, when the Nazis came in, there was a town where Jewish and non-Jewish people, neighbors, got along just fine. But when the Germans came in and said that you could just take your Jewish neighbors' properties, their homes, and anything, you could do anything you want to them, overnight, people that were friends and neighbors were killing each other and just robbing and looting houses because they were given permission. Almost sounds like Black Lives Matter riots, but fortunately for you guys, you're far enough away, I hope, from that. You know? You got some advantages of being far away from New York, right? It's the city, I should say. Yeah, not far enough. I did like so Black Lives Matter tried to do a protest out in Boise, Idaho, because they were trying to do all the cities. And so friends of mine that live out in Boise, if you don't know Boise, well, we're kind of convinced that the state is shaped like a gun if you turn it sideways for a reason. But Black Lives Matter showed up with 50 people to do a protest. And the Second Amendment guys showed up with about 300 or 400. And so they stood fully armed on the steps of the Capitol, and the Black Lives Matter figured, well, this isn't going to work. So they orchestrated a couple weeks later, and they bussed people in from Seattle and Portland and got all these people in. So they got 300 people on buses to come in. And they got out of the buses, and there stood over 3,000 armed men on the Capitol steps. So what did they do? They went to a local, I forget if it was a high school or college, and they filmed a protest there as if they were at the Capitol. And the news is all reporting their protest. And then photoshopped in the Capitol. Yeah. Didn't quite work for them so well in Boise. So the thing is, as we look at this, let's talk about, I want to talk about intersectionality, Marxism. We're just going to cover a couple of those today. So what is intersectionality? This might be a new term for some of you. Intersectionality is this idea that there are different disadvantaged people. And when we look at these groups, we define them as being, they're either oppressed or oppressors. And everyone is supposed to fit into those camps. Now, I realize that with a talk like this, it's hard not to get political in some ways because this whole movement is political. But you end up seeing recently, October 7th, and maybe it's just more personal for me, but October 7th, you ended up having basically a government kidnap people who were doing nothing more than listening to music at a music festival and take them as hostages, killing people. And supposedly, the people that were kidnapped are the oppressors. And the people who did the kidnapping are oppressed. Now, if anyone disagrees with some of the views, I'd be happy to talk about the whole Israeli and Palestinian issue. It's really the issue of Israel versus Hamas is the issue. It's Hamas that is the government there. For all the arguments being made there, Israel has not governed that area for many years. In fact, Israel did forcibly remove people from Gaza, removed the Jewish people out of there when they gave it over to the people of Gaza, that they call themselves Palestinians. By the way, does anyone know what Jewish people that lived in that land were called before 1948? Nope, they're called Palestinian. Yeah, Jewish people are called Palestinians. And then Israel became a state, and it was called Israel. Who owned that land before Israel? The United Kingdom. There was never a Palestinian state. But somehow that has become the way of, because Israel is very prosperous and uses technology, that is what defines them as an oppressor. What is it that defines whites as oppressors? Because whites overall, in their argument, are more successful. They ignore the fact that whether you're white or black, if you are in a broken home, you are less likely to be successful. That is a simple fact that the breakdown of the family is the issue. But again, if you ignore all the things that you need ignored, right? We ignore the breakdown of the family, we ignore anything like that, and just say, nope, it's only because this. So we look at the numbers and say, well, see, there's more blacks that are in jail. Therefore, it must be based on racism. Not based on the percentage of crimes that are done. So what intersectionality is this idea that we have different ways of identifying. Remember, I said this social justice is antisocial. It is a divisionary system. So you divide everyone up into their racial identity, their gender identity, their national identity, their disability identity, their sexual identity. And you get to choose all these things, except race, I guess, because you have to have white privilege. And so what you have is you have these different categories. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you have someone who's black, they get 1 extra point for being black in this intersectionality system. If they're black and female, well, females are oppressed and therefore they get 2 points. If they're black and female and say African, well, now they got a 3rd one. If they're black, female, African, and disabled, they get a 3rd one, sorry, a 4th one. Now, if they are black, female, African, disabled, and transgender, they get another one. This is how this works. You can keep getting, the more points you have, the more oppressed you are, and the more you should have a right to speak in the culture. So the irony, or the way they argue it is that if you're a white male, you don't have the right to speak to the issues of our culture because you're the cause of the problems. So this black woman, African, transgender, disabled person should have more right to speak than you do. There's one special category, though. Do you know there's one category that erases all of these intersectionality points? You could be black, you could be a woman, you could be African, and you could be disabled. But if you're a Christian, 0 points for you. There are Christians that are trying to marry social justice with the gospel. You cannot do that. It is a different gospel. And this is the stuff our culture is buying into. That the idea that somehow we can create a world that's completely fair and ignore everything about human nature. It is based in Marxist philosophy, which would argue that the best system of government is going to be one that is completely equal distribution of wealth. Have you heard the difference in the terms of equality and equity? Let me kind of give an illustration. Equality would be if you were to run a race, which Aaron should do. I would love to take Aaron training with me. Before I ended up hurting myself, I was running about a half marathon a day for fun. I wonder why I got injured. No, but if we're running a race and it's Aaron and I, equality would say that we start this marathon at the same starting point. This is what the American experiment was, that there wouldn't be a class system, that everybody should have an ability to get to the same starting line. But equality is the idea that we should all finish at the same time. So when we run this marathon, and I'm just at the finish line, I have to turn around and wait 5 hours for Aaron to kind of finally get over so we can cross at the same time. Now, equality can never work. You know why? How many presidents do we have right now in the White House? Good answer, 0, yeah. He's the guy really running things isn't in the White House. Right? We only have one president that's currently president. Equality says all of us should have the right ability, if we're fit the definitions, unlike Obama, that we were born in America. But if we all fit the definition, we can all become president. We can actually go through the steps, and there's nothing that should stop us. Equity should say that we're all president. How come the president, the current one, is not arguing that way when he pushes for equity, right? Because if you really take it to its logical conclusion, we're all president, we're all the garbage man, we're all teachers, we're all everything. Because there's no division at all. There's no male, there's no female. Is that even possible? No. Basic common sense tells us that. But see, they don't like to hear that. They just like to have this language that's the high plateaus so they could just use these things to spur up the masses. That's exactly what Marx did. Argued against things like private property so that the government just has everything. And that way, what the government can do is just take from someone who has more and give to that person who has less. That's the idea of it. And so the goal of this is it sounds really good to the person on the bottom, the person who doesn't have anything. That's why the one thing I noticed when I was involved with the Occupy movement, the people that loved it the most were the homeless who had nothing. The others said they liked it until the homeless started taking their stuff. Kind of interesting how that worked out. It's based on a deconstructionism. And one of the things they want to deconstruct is America. I mean, that's what they're doing here. But they want to deconstruct everything everywhere. They want to eliminate Christianity. And this is why it is impossible, when you really understand their goals, it is impossible to marry social justice with the gospel. There is a document you can go read, and if you care to even sign, that I had partaken in. It is called The Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel. Back after I guess this was after they had the Martin Luther King Jr. 50th anniversary, and there was churches that were starting to push social justice, and in different ministries, and many of us got together and saw this as a major problem on the gospel. And many of us got together and said we need to do something about this to warn the church of what social justice is and the danger it is to the gospel. And so what we did was we ended up realizing that we were kind of like the little peons, and so no one's going to take our voice and really hear it. So there was about 75 of us that wrote a letter to John MacArthur. Granted, we didn't all know John, but we knew people that knew John. And so we wrote a letter to John MacArthur because he's got a big voice, and he has been one that, before that, would stand on these issues of the gospel. And so we wrote a letter, and out of that, about 19 guys got together and drafted the statement. They gave it to the rest of us to review, and then we put it out on the internet. And you just search for statement on social justice in the gospel, you'll find it. But I think that's actually, I think it's statement on socialjustice.com or socialjusticeandthegospel.com. But just do the search, and you can see all the thousands of people who signed it, because to warn people. We actually thought at the time that was going to be John MacArthur's last hurrah of a fight for and then this thing called COVID. Any of you guys hear of that thing? Did it make its way up here? I don't know. But what we end up seeing is they want to deconstruct everything. And this ended up leading to this view of liberation theology. It started mostly in the black churches known as black liberation theology, where they wanted to liberate blacks from the oppression. And so the idea that they start to do is to start to look at, they find ways to say that Christianity oppresses. You see this in egalitarianism. You'll see this where the goal is to argue that there should be equality for all in all these different areas. But what do you end up seeing? You end up seeing the big thing where the people have a problem is that God says that there's certain functions for men and certain functions for women. There's certain roles that a man could do in the church. In fact, there's only one that he says women can't do. I don't have the time to do this, but I'll encourage you to do this. Go in your Bibles, look at Genesis chapter 1, and then Genesis chapter 3. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to notice something. And I don't have time to read it all, but I'll tell you what it is, and you go look tonight and you can see. Genesis chapter 1, you have God giving a command, but I'm going to see, you guys are probably pretty astute and probably know the answers. How many trees was Adam told he cannot eat from? One. So how many trees could he eat from? All but one. Right? So there's only one tree he can't eat from. What did the serpent come to Eve with? He says, did God really say you can't eat of any tree in the garden? Now she gets it right and says, no, we can eat of all the trees but one. But what is it Satan does? If God says there's one thing we can't do, Satan says, that's everything. So what Satan says, if God says you can't eat of this tree, then that's like saying you can't eat of any tree. That is what this movement teaches. If a woman can't do one thing, then she's not allowed to do anything. Really? So basically I'm trying to say, if you want to know where social justice comes from, Satan. I think it's satanic. And so what you end up seeing is that the argument that they have is that if you have some, this is why you have men claiming that they have to be able to give birth. They're which boggles my mind, but at Fortune 500 companies, I'm being told that they have like these rooms for birthing mothers to be able to pump out milk. And they have to allow the men in there to do the same thing. What? Yeah, it's just, you sit and you listen, and reasoning people think the world has lost their mind. You know why? Because the world has lost its mind. Okay? But it's like, well, if a man can't give birth, then he can't do anything. Well, there's reasons men can't give birth. They're not designed to. You see, the whole thing that they have an issue with is to deconstruct the order that God has created. And so they want to try to argue that there should be equality in every area. And how they'll argue there's a systemic racism. Whether you know it or not, you are racist. And if you try to prove that you're not racist, that's your white privilege speaking. Now, it's not based on color of skin, because blacks could be racist. Now, it's kind of interesting. See, some blacks can't be racist even if they say racist things against whites, because they're supposedly not of the right economic group. But it still gets kind of weird because Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton make a lot of money, millions of dollars on saying racist things. But somehow their black skin protects them, but then someone like a Clarence Thomas, it doesn't. Was there something different with the color of their skin? No, it's a difference of the agenda. By the way, I'll just say this. When it comes to the issues of America politics, I know as running a nonprofit, you're not supposed to speak about politics, so I won't. I'll just give some facts of history, and you can draw whatever conclusions you want. There were two main parties. There were the Whigs and the Democrats. And there was one party of the South that fought for slavery. Anyone know which party that was? Democrats. Okay, just want to say. There was a party that formed on the platform of freeing slaves, on abolishing slavery. What party was that? Anyone know? The Republicans, yeah. That was the purpose of their party. And they split some of the Democrats and the Whigs and formed a new party. So slave, we have the emancipation. There's no more slavery. There's a party that ends up being the party where we find the KKK was part of. Which party was that? Democrats, okay. There was a party that fought for the civil rights. Which party was that? Republican. There was a party so far you're doing pretty good. Let's see how you do on this one. There was a party that supported the U.S. government getting drugs in from South America and dumping them into the black communities, which destroyed the black families. Anyone know which party that was that supported that? That was the Democrats, Carter administration. You want the destruction of the black family? There's a party that has kept blacks voting for them by telling them you need us. Because once the family was destroyed and women got pregnant, they created a welfare system. Which party supports that? So I will let you guys come to the conclusion which party is trying to keep blacks enslaved and on the plantation and which ones aren't. That's up for you. But what we end up seeing is that they'll talk about LGBTQ, and you notice that plus sign? They keep adding to it. It's the entire alphabet. It's all these different rights. Whatever they need to put in there, they just put it in. Marriage rights, gender roles, right? Here's the thing, though. This is what our culture is dealing with. Now, as Christians, we have one of two choices. We can look at this and we can say, this is not right. I mean, you think about reparations. They keep arguing for reparations. I thought it was hilarious that San Francisco pushed a bill to pay reparations. I don't know if you knew that. And now they're having problems because they can't figure out who's going to pay and who isn't going to pay. Because it really is difficult, because are you going to charge the blacks that are here in America who were kidnapping other blacks, their families were doing that? Should they have to pay? See, now I'll be honest with you. I am completely on board with reparations. I am. I fully support it. Because I think that every person who was supportive of slavery, well, okay, they were all dead now, but if we're going to argue as they argue that the generations afterwards should pay for it, then I think every Democrat should pay every black whose family was a slave in America, they should pay them. And then I think all those blacks should pay all the Republicans who fought for their freedom. That would be fine. I'd be okay with those reparations. You see, because if they're going to argue for fairness, shouldn't it be the people that actually did it pay for those they did it to? But then maybe you should reward the people that fought to free you? But you know what the reality? None of those people are alive today. So who are you really asking to pay? Someone who had nothing to do with it. How is that fair? Should I punish your children for something that my children do? Would that be fair? Let's make it even worse or even different. Should I punish you for something that my grandfather did? You had nothing to do with it, right? That's their idea. Really what this is they're using the idea of reparations for nothing more than, as we said with the Marxism, they want to use it as a way of shifting money from certain people they don't want having money to certain people that do. Because then those people that get that money are going to empower them to steal more from those. And who actually benefits from it? The people who have the right to steal. Let me give you a little bit of Chinese history. And I studied some Chinese history before I met my bride, so it's not just because she's British. She is. She was born in Hong Kong under British rule. She says she's Chinese. I say she's British. You guys help me out. Her passport is from the UK. Is she British or Chinese? Come on. So when we look at it, though, when Mao came in, Mao argued that it was unfair that you had all these wealthy landowners and you had these peasants who were doing all the work, and the landowners didn't have to do anything. They just had to, live life well. That's always the picture. And yet, if you really look at it, even in this type of systems, the person who was the landowner had the responsibility to care for all the people that he took care of, that worked the land. It wasn't just he had to manage things properly. What ends up happening is, when we look at it, is Mao comes in and says, this isn't fair. What we need to do is take the land from the wealthy and give it to the poor. And so the masses said, yes, Mao, Mao, Mao. And guess what happened? Mao came in, he took all the land, gave it to the people, but the people had no clue how to manage it on their own. They only knew how to work it when someone else told them what to do. And all of a sudden, there started to be poverty. And there started to be fights. And so Mao said, well, we got a problem. We have to, there's all this violence. We have to take away all the guns because that will end the violence. So he took all the guns away from the people. But there was still poverty. So what did he do? He said, well, the government will solve your problem. We will take the land from you and you can work for us. And what happened? All they did was transfer the land from the landowners to themselves because they gave themselves the right to steal. That's what's happening in America right now. What's the supreme authority for the Christian? Scripture. Scripture makes it clear. How many races are there in America? One race. Because there's only one race in the entire world. There's the human race. I was telling someone, I think at lunch, about this. When I go to a doctor, whenever I go anywhere, and they have a form, sex, sometimes they now say sex, gender, but sex, they say race. You know what I fill out for race? Human. I just like to see the responses. I'm part of the human race. That is the race. And so what we end up seeing is there is no racism. There are people who treat others differently based on different factors, So is there a racism that exists in the sense where people will mistreat someone because of the way they look? Yes. I remember walking in Central Park talking to this guy. This was right after, I forget the guy who, there was a black who was shot this back when Barack Obama was president. He claimed that the kid looked like his son, or could have looked like his son, and, ignored all the facts, as we found out afterwards that I think Trayvon Martin was his name, I believe, and ignore the fact that Trayvon told his friend that he was going to go jump the guy, but he was somehow this innocent little guy. But what's interesting is I was talking to this black couple, and they were trying to say, well, see, it's just wrong to just judge people immediately just because of the way they look. I said, well, let me ask you a question. You get into an elevator, because his example was, if you get into an elevator with two black guys, are you immediately nervous? And I said, no. No, it might be the martial arts training, but I said, I said, no, I'm not. I said, but let me ask you a question. You get into an elevator, and you see two guys in biker jackets, motorcycle gang. Are you nervous? And his girlfriend said, yeah. I said, why? She goes, because, they might hurt me. I said, so it's okay for you to stereotype, but it's not okay for someone else. See, we often don't think about the fact that everyone has stereotypes. It's a question of whether you are going to be conscious of it and overcome that. And the way to do that is the gospel. You know why I'm not afraid of someone who's black or in a biker jacket? Quite frankly, because I'm going to get a better gospel conversation with them than a guy in a business suit. Just being honest. I'm more about sharing the gospel. I do not like sharing the gospel with anyone in a jacket and tie. When I'm in New York and I'm walking around, I do not like talking to them because they usually don't. They're bad conversations. You give me a biker, you give me a guy that looks like he's going to do some damage to me with tattoos and face piercings all over. I love those guys because you get great conversations. So no, they don't scare me, right? Because I have a totally different mindset when I see people. I don't see them as black and white. I see people as converted or unconverted. And if they're unconverted, they need the gospel. So as Christians, how do we engage our culture? What's our responsibility to the culture? Well, the first thing, and the purpose of this was all to really give you a background to understand what our culture is going through right now. People have literally lost their minds. We can't even figure out what a boy and a girl is anymore. We have justices that sit on the Supreme Court that tell you they cannot define what a woman is. They say only a biologist can. I have a show, Apologetics Live. Anyone can come in on Thursday nights. I was interviewing someone from Answers in Genesis, and a professor from Rutgers called in. So at the end of the show, because they ended up having an impromptu debate, which was great, and at the end I just said, okay, Professor, I have a question for you. Professor Dan, we're told by Supreme Court justices that a Supreme Court justice can't answer this. Only a biologist can answer this. What is a woman? His response was, we don't have enough time in the time left for me to answer that. I said, so are you telling me that when we look at bones of people and we see their bones and we can't figure out this was a male and that's a female? He's like, it's not that easy. It would take me a long time. I have a whole semester I have to explain this. I said, I don't need a whole semester. I said, I can answer what a woman is very simply. A woman is what God, who created her, defined her as. Period. He's the creator. He defined it. And so we have to look at this culture that's lost its mind and give them the truth of the gospel. Should we get into the battle over social justice and try to point out how they're not being logical, they're being silly, they've lost their minds? We want to kind of bang their head against the wall maybe to get some common sense to them, but do we do that? No, it's actually kind of a waste of time because here's the main issue. As a Christian, you are a thinking individual. They are a feeling individual. They don't think anymore. See, we had to get rid of critical thinking in schools so we could talk about evolution. Because you can't have evolution and critical thinking. But now, once critical thinking is gone, anything goes. And so many Christians try to reason with people that don't think, they feel. So you have to understand that. They are a feeling-based mentality. So what do? I tell them they're oppressing me. I do. I do it all the time. Why are you oppressing me? I feel judged. Are you judging me? I just use their language. And it's funny because they tell me I can't do that. That's your oppression right there. That's proof of your oppression. And they can never seem to see what's happening. But the reality is, they need the gospel. So let me close this conference with this. Aaron said the hardest thing he may say is the fact that just because you go to church, just because you come to this conference does not mean you're a Christian. In fact, coming to church every week makes you a Christian as much as going to McDonald's will make you a hamburger. It doesn't work that way. Even though some of these guys think going into the girls' locker room makes them a girl. I haven't noticed any cases of girls wanting to go in the guys' locker room, by the way. Just always seems to be the guys that want to go in the girls'. But the reality is this. We need to understand what the gospel message is. We started off this conference saying there's things that Aaron and I know about all of you. And there's things I know about all of you. Everyone in this room has broken God's law, myself included. We have lied, we have stolen, we have coveted, we have done things that would be a crime in God's sight. Now, if you were to threaten my life, the police would tell you to stay away from me. If you threaten Joe Biden's life, they're throwing you in prison for at least 48 hours. And if you want to challenge the fact of his election, you may be in jail still from January 6th. But that aside, the reality is what made the difference between me and Joe Biden? His position. Well, God is infinitely holy and infinitely just. And therefore, when we break his law, it has an eternal consequence to it. That's why it says in Revelation that all liars will have their place in the lake of fire which burns with brimstone. There is nothing we can hide from God. He is all-knowing. There is no sin you're going to get away with that God didn't see. When we stand before God, he will rightly judge us for every wrongful act we did. But God. Two amazing words that we see in the Bible. But God. God made a way of escape. The infinitely holy God came to earth in human form. Being God, he can pay an eternal fine. Being a human, he could be a substitute for other human beings. And when Jesus Christ died on that cross, he made the full weight of punishment for your sin and my sin back then. He took it all upon himself. This is why it is only within Christianity you have a God that is both just and merciful. Because every other man-made religion is based on human works trying to earn heaven. And if you take your human works and compare it to what Jesus did on the cross, you're diminishing what he did and saying that what you did should count. Almighty God left heaven where all the angels were singing his praises. There was no sin, no starvation, no suffering, no sickness. Jesus left there to come to earth into his own creation, to be part of his creation so that he would be crucified by his very creation. So that he, who knew no sin, would become sin, that we might have the righteousness of Christ. If that does not blow your mind, maybe you're not a Christian. If that doesn't make you feel in awe of this God who created the universe and died on a cross for our souls, to think about that. If you don't know Christ, if you've just been going to church, maybe you've been going to church all your life, and you've always said, well, I do what Christians do, but you have never been converted. You still love your sin, you just hide it from others. Then maybe I encourage you today to get right with Christ. Maybe where you're sitting right now, turn and recognize that you are a sinner who has nothing that can merit eternal life, and you plead before God to ask for forgiveness. Turn and trust what he did on that cross as a payment of sin. If you have questions about that, you could talk to either of the pastors, Pastor George, Pastor Abel. You could talk to Aaron or I. We'd be happy to talk to you. There's no more important issue to get right. Out of everything we talked about this weekend, that is the most important thing for you to get right if you do not know Christ. If you do know Christ, I hope that this weekend has been encouraging to you. I hope it has been edifying to you and equipping to you. That is what we are seeking to do. Because what we're trying to do is to disciple people. You've heard that throughout the weekend. That's what we try to do at Striving for Eternity, is to disciple people, to help churches so that people will hear the gospel. But then, those of us who know Christ, what is our job now? To teach everyone everything Christ taught us. We got to get about doing that. It may be a mother who's teaching their children in the home, teaching their children everything Christ taught them. Maybe you're at your job site doing it. But I hope that we helped give you some things to help you, whether at work, in your family, even in church, to see our responsibility in this world. But we need to rise up. We have one of two choices when we look at our responsibility to culture. We can sit and complain about it, or we can rise up and do something about it. My parting challenge to you is, would you rise up and make a difference in your community? Rise up and share the gospel. Rise up and disciple people so we'd have stronger Christians who know and love the Lord more and are serving the church better. I'll tell you as an observation. I haven't been to a church very long. I've just been here since last night. You guys have a pastor who does everything. Maybe you don't see it because you don't see how much he's doing behind the scenes, but I'm watching him run around everywhere. You should be doing more with him. Don't let him do anything by himself. Okay, maybe he's got to do this study of, you don't have 40 hours to be studying with him, but you could. It wouldn't hurt to do some study. Don't let him do things alone. There should be a lot of people. That's what discipleship is. Living life one-on-one. It's not sitting down at a set time and reading the Bible together. It's living life one-on-one.